Hello, my name is Otoma Edje. Welcome to Image Bearers. I'm so excited to have with us today on our second season, 26th episode of Image Bearers, have Miss Savannah Sipos with us. She posted about a 20-minute video on Facebook recently, which was just awesome, about some of her concerns with racism in the United States and I'm sure across the world. And so I just wanted to have her on the program to discuss a few things. So welcome again. Thanks so much for taking time to join the program, Ms. Savannah.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I know you're obviously a disciple. I think we talked a little bit before the show in the Dallas church there, Dallas-Fort Worth. Can you please share about how God brought you into his kingdom and a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate to have, my parents were both baptized in the early 90s. They'd grown up going to different churches. I think my dad grew up Catholic, and they converted sort of in their college-ish years, and then they met and became friends and got married. And so I was born and raised in like going to church and sort of being surrounded by and also being very fortunate surrounding, like, even within the a very diverse church and a very diverse city, the closest sort of Christian families to us that made up our Bible talk were also very diverse. I think the ones, my earliest childhood, we had my parents, and then I think we had several different ages represented, and then we had several races. Like, I remember the family that we spent the most time with, the kids that I had sleepovers with when I was little, were an African family. And in fact, he got his the husband got his American citizenship like when I was 4 or 5. Like, we had that party and that celebration. So I always grew up surrounded by a lot of faces that looked different racially, and even in terms of economics, although it was not something that like you could pick, you'd pick up when you're little, but knowing that like people's houses didn't look alike, people lived in different places, people had different cars, but it was never a game. It was, so I grew up surrounded by all of that. And then when I was in high school, I decided to sort of pursue a relationship with God on my own, because I had gone to church and my parents they never pushed any sort of studying the Bible, or they never sat and made sure that I said my prayers or read the Bible or whatever. They very much let me come to it on my own. We just had these discussions. If I had questions, I could ask it of them. If I, when bad things happened, the family would pray together, we'd pray over meals and things like that. So it was around and very much integral to my life, but there was never a pressure. And then after some difficult family experiences, I decided that I wanted to try to understand and approach God on my own. And so I did. And so when I was 15, I actually made the decision to get baptized. And so from there, kind of building my own relationship and my own path, even within my household.
Okay, that's awesome. That's awesome. I know it can be a challenge, growing up in the church, as I've seen different kingdom kids, they can go one way or another. So it's awesome to hear that, you made that decision to definitely, pursue God and definitely continue to grow in a great way. Yeah. So I know that right now you're going for a master's in applied sociology at the University of Texas, Dallas. What inspired you to study sociology?
It's funny, I joke with people that I was kind of doing sociology my whole life, even if I didn't know what it was until I was well into high school. I would always annoy my history teachers because they would sort of give me facts and information, but an interpretation, but then I was always asking the out of nowhere questions. like, I think the moment that really jumps out at me when I was in the 6th grade, we had to do, my 6th grade social studies teacher, we basically were doing a world history, proto-world history, barely sort of introducing all of these kids to new world religions and different countries and, you know, history and all of that. Well, he also did a debate component, taught us how to do some research at a young age. And so he divided the class into quarters, and my team was Genghis Khan, good or bad, and we had to argue for. And I think it was also great because it was the first introduction to the idea of sort of moral relativity is such a strong word, but it's like when you're in the 6th grade, everything is either right or wrong. You either do the right thing or the wrong thing, which makes you good or bad. You're very black and white, which is fine because like the world tends to be very black and white when you're 12. But this was sort of our first, it was a nice, safe, sort of distanced introduction to that whole, the idea of relativity. And I remember he gave us access to, we had labs and stuff, but we also had access to like college textbooks, which was really cool because it, you know, basically if you could read it, understand it, and use it, it was fair game, which built, I think, a lot of confidence in the classroom. And one of the things that I found was it was the first time I found out that there was a miniature ice age going on at the beginning of Genghis Khan's rule. It was like 100-year ice age where the whole planet was about 2 degrees colder than sort of the normal temperature. And it hit Europe and Central Asia really hard. And so that was the first time I was like, that's why they started expanding like crazy. Because they needed places to go. And so from there, my team ended up winning. But it was funny because I think, you know, for my teacher, that we had one of the best research topics, one of the best research sides, sort of pro sides of a figure like Genghis Khan. I guess he had a couple that he rotated around every couple of years. And we had one of the best. And for me, it was realizing that it's not like history isn't us versus them, with us for some reason always being Western Europeans. Even in a classroom with a Muslim, like Latina and Black children and white children, it was always Eurocentric. The good guys were always the Europeans, but it was understanding that you had sort of like not neutral, but gray humans on each side of everything.
Gray in terms of their morals, is it like how they were reacting to things, in other words?
Yeah, well, not just gray in terms of their morals, but more like I don't actually have a dog in a fight that happened 1,300 years ago. They could both be morally flawed or, you know, morally correct. Like you have just imperfect humans running around doing stuff in real time. And so from there, as I got older, I started really getting into history and I liked it. And that was the thing that I always tried to remind myself was history happens in real time. When we read history books, it's easy to criticize. It's easy to say, well, you know, why didn't you do this or that? But I'm like, these are people who are reacting to things as they're coming. Mm-hmm. The guys who signed the Declaration of Independence didn't know whether or not they were going to end up dead at the end of the war. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that was something that when I found out sort of what sociology, when I discovered sociology and anthropology, actually through television, mm-hmm. the TV show Bones, when I was a junior in high school, I was like, oh, and it was great because I saw the character of Bones. I saw somebody that thought like I did. And I was like, oh, that thing that my brain does all the time, that's a job. This is great.
Sociology, can you break down real quick sociology? That's the study of people. Is that, how would you?
No, so it's more the study of how people and society interact and how society comes together. So in terms of the differences, the best way I can liken it is, if psychology, you're studying sort of an individual tree, sociology is the study of like forestry. It's how does the whole forest fit together? How do types of trees fit together? How does one individual tree doing something weird affects the whole? So, you know, I've never heard of something like clinical sociology, because you're more trying to understand what happens when you put a bunch of humans together and they have to interact.
So it must be very interesting for you right now when you look at the United States, especially with everything going on, the interaction amongst people, just between blacks and whites, and just even politics. I mean, we don't want to get into that necessarily, but I think it must be a very interesting time for you as you look at all those aspects of interactions.
I mean, yes, but it's also scary.
Yeah.
Because, you know, especially when you have an interest in history, you know, history and politics are tied together, because often politicians or the political apparatus of anything, of every group, they're the ones making sort of the big sweeping turns in history. So watching behavior and some of the behavioral trends that I see, especially the behavioral trends that I have seen over the past several years, growing and being allowed to grow in, not just in, I'll say, like mainstream Christian denominations, but specifically in the church and the movement I grew up in, honestly, it is fascinating, but it is also troubling, because there are times where I see problematic behavior that I don't know how to address, and I don't know how it would be addressed, but I also know that I think it is vital that it should be addressed. I'm a very like ground up kind of person. I'm very much nurture over nature thinker. In terms of that's sort of my philosophy approach. So there are times where I am concerned about some of the things that are allowed to be said on social media, or that are not talked about in person, because I see disciples building habits as a collective that is concerning, because you're sort of watching. As a sociologist, it's fascinating to watch basically a collective, a group, a sub, its own, a society, if you will, of people coming together and sort of deciding amongst themselves, how do we handle this new medium of social media that lets us all interact in new ways and democratizes speech? How do we fit together? Because most rules develop that way. Most social rules develop as things are being used. But as a disciple, I'm troubled because I see threads of some things that border to me on border on nationalism, overt racism, all of that being woven into our new rules. So on the one hand, I don't know, I guess it's like being an engineer in a car crash. You're like, oh, this is fascinating, but also serious, scary.
Yes. So I know in your Facebook post, in the video that you had, you basically had, and I'll try to just read it to make a point here. You basically mentioned that our system has been corrupted by racism and needs to be uncorrupted. And my words are discipled out of its racist past. So can you share a little bit about the unconscious bias that you think is already kind of like built into our system right now? What are some of the things that you see?
Yeah, so I think I'll say this. I'm speaking mostly for Americans,
Sure,
because
sure.
I know that there are disciples from other countries. Hang on, I dropped something. There are disciples in other countries who have sort of different cultural contexts. But one of the things that I think about is the fact that um, most Americans are not used to seeing Black people and women in positions of power or authority. I think about like the top executives, like some of the like if I asked you to sort of list out like the wealthiest Americans you could think of, they would be Zuckerberg, Gates, Elon Musk, um, Jeff Bezos. The CEOs are overwhelmingly white and they're overwhelmingly male. But then when you go even behind that, corporate executives and the members of boards on not just like, I'm thinking of also just like um powerful nonprofits and the powerful universities and powerful funds are incredibly white and incredibly male. And then you turn to our government structure. All of our presidents, all of our executives, save one, have been white, and at the moment, all of them have been male. All of our vice presidents have been white and male. And so what that means is the way that when people are asked to think of, like, picture a CEO in your head, even if they're supposed to make one up, they're almost assuredly going to pick a white guy.
That reminds me of like Santa Claus, where ask little kids about Santa Claus. The first thing they're thinking of is a white guy, a white, older, rotund gentleman. If they think of
Exactly.
like a black Santa, well, that's probably Santa's helper.
Yeah, well, and I think, and even more than that, like, Santa's a character with its own, historical context and da-da-da-da. A CEO is a job.
Sure.
Being chair of a board is a job. And so I think because so many of these, when we think of power, even on the screen, you don't see, like I think about, like, you don't see romantic comedies with Black leads. And if they do, they're centered around poverty and dance, usually. Even, I'll say, quote unquote, like the Black stories that the media decides are worth telling in film often are either period pieces, which deal with oppression inherently and implicitly, or they deal with poverty. And so what that means is, even when it comes to like white people on the street, they do not expect to see a Black man in a position of power. Reporters, even Comedy Central talks about that when they send Black correspondents out to film on location, Black correspondents in suits will get stopped more than a white guy in schlubby, overworked producer clothing.
Yeah, I've even heard a situation where as far as hiring, they would hire a Caucasian who has a felony over a Black person who has a degree.
Yes, I wish I could remember who did that study, but yes, and that's not, and when I say they, just to sort of clarify, I guess for the record, they is not the media outlets that I was discussing. This was a study done on small businesses or businesses and corporations and stuff. They didn't know they were being whatever. And you can't even blame like a camera or this person's going to be looked up, like nothing. This is normal jobs. And there's a host of studies where if you know, also like Black sounding names on resumes get set aside versus white sounding names. And the like, it's a never ending thing, but I think especially in our minds. And that was sort of one of the things that I discussed is when we see a Black person outside or in a position of power, something in your brain as an American goes, that's not right. And you're not thinking, what is he doing there? But he is not the prototypical whatever. And there are times where, as an individual, I think, you know, that is why for people who don't think of themselves as racist, they had a hard time with President Obama. They had to find other things that he did. I think about the infamous tan suit scandal or him asking for Dijon mustard, because they had to find a reason to be angry besides something in my brain, you know, something inside of me gets really annoyed when I see him being whatever. I mean, I was having a discussion, I think, with my father, and one of the things that I said is I was like, Barack Obama was always going to be handicapped in some ways with the Senate. I'm like, because there are senators who were like functioning adults or almost adults at a time when an uppity Black man was a phrase. Like that was a thing that was said openly. That was a type of person. And so I was like, unless he decided to take his Senate majority and force through his agenda, which would come with its own problems, which would come with its own biases, he was always going to be hobbled in that way just because of his race. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I think even in the leadership in our churches, I would not be shocked to see a level of white, you know, young white men versus young Black men. Young white men are more likely to be seen as sort of, oh yeah, he's a go-getter, he's really did it, while a Black man may be more likely to be seen as, you're kind of aggressive, take it down a notch. Or same for women. I see a lot of women when they're leading out in their ministries. I've experienced this myself. Women being told, like, you need to kind of like cool it down with, you know, trying to plan so many things and lead so many things, because you're making the men feel uncomfortable. And instead of turning to the men and being like, you need to mimic them, the sisters were basically told, like, hey, don't, you know, cool it down a little bit.
I think it's a terrible thing, and I think the thing is to understand, to realize that a lot of the bias, yes, there is some overt stuff, but to understand there is the unconscious part. And I think that's where, you know, training comes in. I think especially like our family of churches, we have a great solution, I believe, which is discipling relationships and just in general mentoring, to be able to keep reminding people, hey, let's make sure we're having some self-evaluation. You know, I know some churches have developed what are called squads,
Yes,
which basically
did that well last year.
Yeah, which basically have some way of, you know, educating the majority, you know, majority people in the church of just some of the racism and just inequality and just ways to come together, you know, about issues. So I know you had a little bit of a personal
also one
story.
of the things,
Go ahead.
Just before we move on, one of the things that I think is also incredibly helpful is the fact that we're so geographically driven, especially I think in sort of the new millennium, sort of post 2003, the idea of raising up leaders where they were from. And I think that also prevents a certain some of the neo-colonialist problems that can exist with sort of proselytizing religions like Christianity, is the fact that you basically have like white priests and pastors coming to, oh, poor African countries or poor whatever countries or poor Asian countries, and erasing their home culture, because to be Christian is to be good, and to be like me is to be good, so to have my home culture is to be good. So like that cycle. And because I think our church does make a concerted effort to, when you plant a church in a new country, you raise and train locals to take over from the mission team, and then you take locals from within a country to plant the next mission team in that country, means that you don't have, you know, colonists. Like the goal is, you know, I think about like Russia's a great example. Within 20, 30 years, you don't have foreigners really leading in Russia. And those that do have lived there for decades, and often married Russians. It's a very different system. And so I think that's also an incredibly, it's so small, but it's so helpful. And I think in some ways, doing that in the US will, by osmosis, not by osmosis, but sort of just naturally increase the diversity in BioTalk leaders, but also full-time leadership. Because some places are blacker and whiter than others. You know, some places are more, think about El Paso is just more Hispanic Latino than Montana. Actually, Montana's a bad example because I think they have a above average Hispanic population. But, you know, Tennessee. Tennessee and El Paso have very different makeups. But by raising locals to train and to invest where they were sort of living already, you can increase the diversity just naturally without having to sit and run the numbers.
So I think in your video also on Facebook, you mentioned your boyfriend who is Black, and he's in Belgium, I believe, right now. And I think you mentioned that, you know, if your relationship progresses and you have kids, obviously you're going to now have, you know, Black kids. And like right now, if you call the police, you know, as a white Caucasian woman, it's typically like, you know, the police are here to protect me. Now, if you are married and, you know, you call the police and you have Black children, you have a different mind and a different thought process as far as the police coming. Can you share about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's just sort of a very simple thing. Like when I was a kid, I knew if I ever got separated from my parents, I should go find an adult in uniform, security guard, policeman, whatever, if we were at a baseball game or whatever. But, you know, when I got older, we were talking to a family friend of ours, and she was talking about her children. We're told to go find an older Black woman first, or an older Black man second. Basically just go find somebody that looks like your grandma, and that's who you get help from, because you can't trust, because they're not going to sit and discuss, they're not going to sit and help you. The police won't sit and help you the same way. And I think, you know, as I got older, I noticed that with my friends. And so for me, it's like it wasn't until high school where I sort of discovered, or I learned about like that there's like that in Black families, there's the talks, you know, like there's the birds and the bees talk, but then there's here's how, if the police stop you, here's what you do. And so for me, it's like if I, you know, if either with my current boyfriend or just down the road, if I end up being sort of the primary caregiver of Black children, but especially Black boys, you cannot be a responsible caregiver to Black boys without acknowledging the fact that they are in danger on site. I think about on my own block. So my block is interesting because across the street, out this window, across the street, you have a family I've never seen. I have no idea what their race is. I don't see their cars. This house could be empty or haunted. Don't know. And you have a Hispanic family, an older white family, a white family, and then the house next to them is currently vacant, but it was recently, up till recently, inhabited by a white family. And then there's a house on the other side. Now, before, for years, it was inhabited by a mixed race family.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got stories about that. That's interesting. And now it's inhabited by a Black family. And we've had different race families on this side of the street. I guess we've had more people moving in and out. But we've had multiple times over the almost 15 years that we've lived in this house, the police have come, and the way I felt and the way my parents felt and the way the block reacted was different based on whose house the cop car was put in front of.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the last couple of years, being watchful. If, this house, the house with our Black neighbors, or the house next door to us, there's also a young Black family there now, and 2 doors down. If the cop car is parked in front of those streets, my parents will stay outside and watch. If it's a different house across the way, if it's one of the white houses down the street, my parents will sort of peek out and go inside.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just, and honestly, that is a natural part of being a responsible neighbor to Black people in a well-to-do part of town where they're the minority and more likely to be seen as not belonging. Like, I think my neighborhood is like the one that Ahmaud Arbery was murdered in.
Mm.
They're going to be thought of as out of context. Less so now than, 15 years ago when we first moved in. We've had more and more Black families just around the neighborhood. But still, on site, they're going to be seen as an other. Like, if I drove 20 minutes away and just started walking around a suburban neighborhood where no one knew me, people would assume I lived there.
Mm-hmm.
You took my boyfriend, even. My boyfriend's not he's not some giant imposing figure. He's just like a dude. If you sent him into that same neighborhood, people would assume that he's not from there. So
yeah, I think I saw something on, I think it was Facebook, about this Caucasian pastor. He had a TV under his arm.
He had a TV under his arm, and he wasn't even stopped.
He was running down the street. This is after Ahmaud Arbery was shot or was murdered. And he said, nope, nobody stopped me, So, but, we definitely have a lot of problems. And I think what you mentioned about unconscious bias is true. I think there definitely is overt racism where people, that's how they are. But I think there is also the unconscious aspect. My question to you as we kind of close things out is, what can we do to, as a society, really start to address these matters? I know obviously people are sprouting all kinds of things, and maybe some of them are right. But I think for yourself as a sociologist, what are your thoughts?
I think one of my thoughts is, I think for everyone, find ways to break yourself of the thought process that white men are the default human.
Yeah.
And I say that knowing it is difficult. So a little bit of background, the medical schools as we know them started off in England and Ireland. The only cadavers that they could use were executed prisoners. Well, by mathematics and the enforcement of legal law in Ireland and Britain, the only cadavers you were going to get were white men. So the earliest autopsies and books were written based on white men. And that continued, that bias continued. Now, white men are seen as the default in medicine, in politics, in whatever. If I think, if you drill yourself and think about certain positions, the first person you're going to think of is, like if I asked you to think of a random nurse, you're probably either going to think of a white woman with like a 1950s nurse's outfit, often from like childhood or, the old Hanna-Barbera cartoons kind of a deal, or you're going to think of a woman of color who's a foreigner, because that's a lot of nurses are now, because women of color get things done. But when you think of positions of power and authority and beauty, and influence and intelligence and goodness, white guy comes up every time, almost every time. And so I think even people of color have this bias. From the time we're little, we're drawn to white faces because of how they're portrayed and because of the way they are in toys. So I think starting early, starting with your children, if you get them a baby doll, get them a black baby doll, even if they're white. Get them seek them out. Try to find TV shows that show black people as often as white. Try to highlight people of color when they're in positions of power, but also don't assume people of color do not have to be extraordinary to be deserving of power. There's a common sort of joke in, I think, activists, I see it a lot in activist cultures and whatever, where we talk about sort of the mediocre white man. And it's the idea that basically white men don't have to be prodigies to be successful. If you are a middle class, upper middle class white guy, you can be a B/C average person in just all aspects of your life, still do really well. White women don't have that advantage. Women of color especially don't have that advantage. Men of color don't have that advantage. So I think something we as people can do is recognize that people of color can be good without having to be great. When George Floyd was murdered, everyone, or not everyone, so many people started digging into his past to try to find a parking ticket, because for some reason, if you're a black man who's been murdered by the police, a parking ticket becomes a capital offense. Meanwhile, we have a laundry list of, average white dudes who walk around with just weapons, or have walked around with weapons after murdering people and still were brought in quietly. And so I think for us as people, and I have to work on this myself, is really try to break yourself of the idea that black people are variants of the white default. Like when you're making your character in a video game, there's always that sort of default person that they start off with. Black people are not, the default, or they're not a variant of a default. Women are not the variant of a default. LGBT people are not variant of a default. Autistic people are not variant of a default. They're just as deserving of existence. They are not something.
Yeah, and I think that's why I call this show the image bearers. So I think everyone bears the image of God. So it's not a matter of, as you said, having a default and a variant, which is definitely, I mean, that I think is perfect the way that you state that, because even the way the United States started, there was a default, which was white, rich males. And then the variant was actually everybody else. And actually the variant, I think the variant of the variant was actually Black people. So that even the 3/5 of the vote was for the white plantation owners, not even for the actual. So I think what you're saying is perfect.
Yeah, and for me, I think that variant of a default concept is so pervasive.
Yeah.
It's in our safety protocols. Women are in more danger in car accidents because the car crash dummies are either sort of the calculated average man,
Mm-hmm.
weight, height, proportions, and 12-year-old child. There is no seatbelts, airbags, crumple zones do not get tested on anything on women. They get tested on men and children. We're hoping. And so I think not just encouraging, but and I say try to break the variant of a default in your own mind, but I think for anyone who's watching this, go and look at your discipline, whatever your job is, and go see if in your test materials, in your pre-prepared slides, in your literature, in your books, in medicine, if every picture you see is white, if every picture you see is male, or if there is always a white male and they have a sort of non-standard variant standing next to him, find ways to address it. I wish I could remember his name, but there is a doctor, a young doctor, who introduced the first sort of a near exhaustive list of how diseases presented on dark skin. Because showing what the mumps looks like always, in the school nurse's office, it was always white people on the medical models. So if I had a rash on my arm, the nurse could look at it and spot it. But melanin changes the way that certain rashes, things like poison ivy even, will show up on your skin. The nurse would have a much more difficult time diagnosing that. Doctors have a more difficult time diagnosing things, and that's, and so now we're starting to address that idea of a white default. But I think, to anyone watching this, going home, going back to sort of your work and looking around and seeing, do you only have one Black executive?
Mm-hmm.
Do you only have one female executive?
Mm-hmm.
That's also a problem, because when you have one of something, they become tokenism is dangerous, because often when if there's one executive on a board who's a woman, that seat becomes the woman's seat. We don't need to promote another woman. We've got one. We've got our Smurfette. It's called Smurfette syndrome, actually. We've got our Smurfette. We're good. But guess what? For that woman, that means every other up-and-coming ambitious woman becomes her competition, because her seat is now the Smurfette seat. So she is either going to be removed and replaced with another woman, or she's going to move on and retire of her own volition and be replaced by a woman. And so I think even something as simple as there should be two of non-standard whatever, it should be normal for there to be multiple of
Yeah, I think also just the pressure because that woman now represents all women. She used to represents she's taken as a representative. Same with if it's one black person in a certain organization, they
I
now
don't know how, like,
represent the
honestly, I
entire
don't know
organization.
how Kamala Harris for a long time, I don't know how Kamala Harris functions in the Senate because she's only, I think, the second black female senator. So she has to represent in a lot of ways what every black woman is, and she's South Asian, so there's that added pressure of representing her
Sure.
South Asian people and whatever. And so I don't know how, like, I wouldn't be able to function with that pressure. And that pressure is real. There's a study, and I'll try to find it and send it to you so you can link it somewhere, but where if a woman makes a mistake in a presentation or at work, it's thought of as basically, oh, it's her fault because she's bad at her job. If a man makes a mistake in a presentation or in his job, oh, he probably had a bad day.
Yeah, please send that to me.
And if you flip it, if
Yeah.
a woman is good at her job, she does
Yeah.
it, she knocks it out of the park, oh, she was just really lucky.
You know what? I see this. I think the same thing happens, even like if an African American does really well. Oh, they got affirmative action. So it flips the other way too. That it's always like you're supposed to be on the bottom rung, and if ever a person is off of that bottom rung as an African American, it's ascribed to. There's a reason that's not even them as to why they're exceptional, and they're just one of the ones that made it through.
Which is part of why, for me, I'm like, your power structure in your company there should be a smattering of different people in it. Because when you have everyone's like, when you have just basically all white men plus like one black guy, I think about when you watch a romantic comedy, if there's like four friends, if there's like one black guy, he's never like the other guys. Like to the point where, like, you know, he's always got to be smarter and quibbier, like he's the sage black friend with like the great advice, like whatever, like that whole thing. But also he's got to be more, he always speaks different. He always speaks in that sort of AAVE, but like not too much, you know, kind of a deal. He's always this very curated character. But there's never any other black people in the movie. Like, he's just, so that tokenism also creates an interesting dichotomy in terms of like, this black guy's got to be perfect.
Yeah.
Otherwise it weighs on everyone else. And so I think in so many ways, that's something that we are the products of. Because if every black person in the movies is a criminal or like a saint and a genius and whatever, you don't see actual normal black people. Right. That's why I kind of love, there's a movie called The Lovebirds, and it stars, I think, Issa Rae and Kumail Nanjiani. And I love it because it's like a normal, like, date night gone wrong movie, and the leads just happen to be people of color. And they're not like, they're not one of those movies where you could totally switch them out with white characters and nothing would change. But they're not, you know, they're not in some sort of prearranged box. They're just like normal human being people running around having the worst date night ever. And I love that because black people deserve, and this is going to sound so crazy, all people deserve permission to be mediocre sometimes. Because the pressure of having to be excellent constantly is undeserved, and also is something that white men never have to face. Almost never have to face. I think was Michelle Wolf said this beautifully when Wonder Woman was coming out. I think it was Michelle Wolf. And there was a, basically somebody was commenting on like a comedy show, like a Seth Meyers or a Trevor Noah, that it looks like Wonder Woman's going to be an amazing film. Like, this is going to be really good for future superhero films. And the comedian, she responded, she goes, yeah, she goes, but even if it sucks, like, we should still get another woman superhero film. And he's like, what? And she's like, yeah. She goes, men make terrible 10 terrible superhero movies every year, and no one's like, well, no more man superhero movies. Like, women, Charlie's Angels, the new Charlie's Angels reboot, meh, wasn't that great? You know what, though? The next woman-dominated spy movie shouldn't have to be like, well, what about Charlie's Angels? What about it? You don't have to be perfect to deserve a place at the table.
Right. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Now, one of the things I appreciate about you, just as we wrap up, I think I know we shared right before the show that you're reading or have read a few books I think have been really cool to really help inform your mind as it relates to, poverty and so forth, to really understanding that aspect of us being image bearers and really taking care of everyone equally. And can you share about at least one of those books that you've read that really could help us better understand those aspects too?
Yes, I'll say this. I'm actually going to go with this one. It's called Unequal Childhoods by Annette Lareau. Mm-hmm. And it deals with the way that class in your childhood, class differences, how it shapes the way that you interact with your family members, but also one of my favorite parts of this book is when Lareau highlights the fact that upper middle class children, by virtue of extracurriculars, actually, are more comfortable, consistently more comfortable in sort of bureaucratic situations and in exerting themselves in bureaucratic situations than sort of poorer class, so like working class or poor children. And sort of, but especially, and this shows up also with race. So this is about things like advocating for themselves in a doctor's appointment if they feel like they're being blown off, or being comfortable moving around and whatever. And I think that's also, that's an important thing, because in some ways, it's very easy for people to declare a Black person or a person who grew up poor or working class as out of place. But some of that is because they look like they're out of place because they feel out of place, because they're not trained, because these things perpetuate themselves.
Right.
And so Lareau, I think, does a great job of sort of highlighting the way that race and class can affect your culture without falling into some of the culture of poverty, they just can't help it stereotypes. So this is, I think, a great, it's a great book, and it's, I have the second edition. It was pretty affordable when used. I think it was less than $20, and it's definitely a good one, very accessible. You don't have to be a social scientist to really come through it. She does an excellent job.
Okay. Well, thanks again so much for your heart. I think it's just inspiring to see, someone like yourself just really sticking up for, and really just being a disciple. I mean, I can't put it any other way. That's really what I think every human should do. But I think definitely, I would say every Christian who should have a mindset to really be an image bearer, to really see themselves, first of all, in the eyes of God, to not be insecure or what have you. But then I think secondly, to take that one step further and to treat others as image bearers too. And I think it's a very simple concept, but I think the world would be so much better if we had more of that mindset. So
yeah,
thanks so much.
I was joking with a friend, and it's a joke, but also it's kind of true. And it's a rule of thumb. If you're ever at a protest or a march or whatever, and or on an issue, and you look over and you realized all of the Black people, but especially Black women, are over there. Like, you may have 2 Black women on your side, but if like 900 of them are over there, history shows you're on the wrong side. Like,
Yeah.
if you're ever like, you know, God, I feel like I'm just not sure. Like, I'm feeling kind of conflicted. If all of the Black people are over there, you need to be over there. If all the people of color, if everyone on this side's white and everyone on there is not, that's where that's the right side of history is that side.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a lot of work to do. And I think I'm glad that you're someone who's studying these matters. I think we definitely need people who are educated to bring their heart and their education, you know, to bear on the world, because it's not just one thing that needs to change. You know, as you said, it's not just one person. It's like everything, the interaction within society, and there's many aspects of that. So thanks so much for your heart. Thanks so much for your education. I'm sure we're going to see a lot more in the future.